She never had a tell-all interview. She never gave the tabloids a scandal big enough to define her, though she came startlingly close more than once. And yet, by the final years of the longest reign in British history, palace insiders and royal commentators were quietly calling her something none of the more famous royal wives ever quite managed to earn: the Queen's favourite. No royal wedding fanfare built that reputation. No headline-grabbing charity gala did either. It was built, slowly and almost invisibly, out of decades of exactly the kind of unglamorous, undramatic loyalty most people never notice until it's suddenly gone. And it survived at least 2 genuinely mortifying public scandals along the way that could easily have ended a less resilient royal career before it properly began. This is the story of how a middle-class public relations executive from Oxford became one of the most quietly trusted women inside Buckingham Palace, what it actually cost her to get there, and why the road was considerably rockier than her current reputation for quiet perfection tends to suggest. Welcome to Blue Blood Mysteries. Sophie Helen Rhys-Jones was born in January 1965 at the Radcliffe Infirmary in Oxford, one of 2 children raised in a quiet Kent village. Her mother Mary was the daughter of a bank manager and worked part-time as a secretary. Her father Christopher built a career importing tyres. It was, in every meaningful respect, an ordinary middle-class English upbringing. Considerably closer to the world most of the country actually lived in than to the landed, titled circles that had traditionally supplied the monarchy with its in-laws. Genealogists later established a distant aristocratic thread somewhere in her family tree, a detail the press seized on with evident relief, as though it made her origins slightly less startling. It didn't really change anything. Sophie grew up close to both her parents, attended school locally, earned 8 O-levels and 2 A-levels, and then, at 18, chose secretarial college over university, a decision that placed her firmly outside the more conventionally academic path some of her future royal in-laws had followed. Her 20s were spent trying out a genuinely wide range of work, including a season employed at a Swiss ski resort before she moved to London in the 1980s and found her footing in public relations. She worked in PR for Capital Radio during this period and, in one of the more frequently repeated footnotes of her pre-royal life, handled publicity connected to the popular and deliberately absurd British television character Mr. Blobby. A detail that has followed her ever since as a kind of charming, slightly bewildering trivia question. Colleagues from this stretch of her career consistently described her as hard-working, professional, and easy to get along with, someone who handled the unpredictable demands of press relations with genuine skill rather than simply riding on personal charm. By the mid-1990s, she had co-founded her own public relations company and was earning a solid independent income, entirely unconnected to royalty and entirely her own. She had actually crossed paths with Prince Edward once before, briefly, in 1987, though nothing came of that initial encounter. The relationship that mattered began in 1993. And it began in a setting almost nobody would have predicted, a real tennis tournament at Hampton Court Palace. Edward was playing that day, the person originally scheduled to partner him wasn't available, and Sophie, present at the event, volunteered to fill in. Whatever chemistry developed on the court that afternoon carried straight through into a genuine relationship. And the 2 of them began seeing each other shortly afterward. It is one of those small, almost accidental beginnings that in hindsight ends up carrying an entire subsequent history behind it, had Sophie not been working in a field that put her in that particular social orbit, or had she not happened to be free that specific afternoon. the following 3 decades of royal history might have looked considerably different. The relationship did not stay private for long. In December 1993, the news of the world broke the story of Edward and Sophie's romance, a scoop credited to Andrew Morton, the journalist who had already achieved enormous notoriety for his explosive, unauthorized biography of Princess Diana. Once Morton had the story, intense paparazzi attention followed almost immediately, and Sophie found herself thrust, with essentially no preparation, into the specific, punishing scrutiny reserved for any new romantic partner of a senior royal. Rumour at the time blamed Sarah Ferguson for the leak, though the more credible account points instead to an employee inside Buckingham Palace as the actual source. What happened next was genuinely unusual, and it deserves real attention, because it set a precedent that would echo decades later. Within 48 hours of the story breaking, Edward personally sent a fax to newspaper editors and broadcasters through his own production company, directly requesting that they respect Sophie's privacy and treat her, in his words, as a human being rather than simply a story to be pursued. It was the first time a member of the royal family had taken that kind of direct, personal step to intervene on behalf of a partner facing tabloid pressure, and the fact that Sophie herself came from a PR background inevitably raised the question of how much input she may have had in shaping that approach. Whatever its origin, the letter didn't stop the press from pursuing Sophie relentlessly in the years that followed, generating a long string of sensationalized stories, and, eventually, at least one deliberate tabloid sting. The parallel to Prince Harry's own, considerably more forceful, public statement defending Meghan Markle's privacy more than 2 decades later is difficult to miss, though those close to the family have noted that Sophie's experience of tabloid intrusion, driven substantially by relentless comparisons to Diana's beauty and style, was in some ways even more openly personal and unkind than what Meghan would later face. The Queen, for her part, extended Sophie a genuinely rare accommodation during this period of intense scrutiny. Edward was living at Buckingham Palace at the time, and the Queen granted Sophie her own security pass, allowing her to come and go from the palace freely and, notably, to stay overnight, a privilege not typically extended to an unmarried royal girlfriend. One frequently retold anecdote from this stretch of the relationship captures its slightly absurd, very human texture rather well. Officially, Edward and Sophie were not permitted to share a room, and on one occasion, as Edward attempted a late-night, unauthorized visit to Sophie's room at Windsor Castle, he stepped squarely on one of the Queen's corgis in the dark hallway, setting off a howl loud enough to force an immediate, hasty retreat. It's a small story, but it captures something true about the earliest years of the relationship. 2 adults navigating a genuinely old-fashioned set of household rules while quietly, gradually building the kind of trust that would eventually define their entire royal partnership. Sophie and Edward dated for 6 years, weathering constant press speculation about an eventual wedding date, before their engagement was finally announced in January 1999. Sophie's own parents spoke warmly and simply about their future son-in-law at the time, and about their confidence that their daughter, despite having no prior connection to royal life, would manage the transition well, given how gradually she had already been easing into it. That confidence would be tested almost immediately, and in a genuinely humiliating way. Only 3 weeks before the wedding, the Sun newspaper published a photograph of Sophie taken 11 years earlier while on holiday in Spain, showing her with her top pulled up by the radio and television presenter Chris Tarrant in a moment of casual private horseplay from her Capital Radio days. Sophie had known the photograph existed and had been assured, years earlier, that it had been destroyed and would never surface. Instead, a colleague of Tarrant's reportedly paid a 6-figure sum by the newspaper, had held onto a copy and eventually sold it for maximum tabloid value at precisely the moment it could cause the most damage. Tarrant himself gave a notably defensive account of the photograph publicly that same day, framing it as a harmless moment of fun rather than anything more serious. Sophie, by every account, felt genuinely and deeply betrayed. Buckingham Palace responded forcefully, describing the publication as calculated cruelty, and the backlash proved severe enough that the individual who had actually sold the photograph was dismissed from their job and relocated abroad. The Sun, in an unusually humbling turn for a tabloid rarely inclined toward contrition, publicly apologized and made a substantial donation to charities of Sophie's own choosing. It was, by any measure, a battle the palace and Sophie ultimately won in terms of public sympathy, but the timing, 3 weeks before her wedding day, made it a genuinely mortifying ordeal to endure regardless of the eventual vindication. Whatever damage that episode did to Sophie's spirits in the run-up to the big day, it appears to have generated a wave of public sympathy that carried her through the wedding itself and well beyond it. She and Edward married on the 19th of June, 1999, at St. George's Chapel, Windsor. The first time in more than a century that the son of a reigning monarch had married there rather than at one of the grander London venues previous royal weddings had favoured. The choice was deliberate. Coming directly after Charles and Diana's enormous, spectacle-driven wedding at St. Paul's Cathedral and Andrew and Sarah Ferguson's own grand Westminster Abbey ceremony, Edward and Sophie wanted something considerably smaller and more intimate, and they got it, roughly 500 guests, a genuinely modest number for a marriage involving a senior member of the royal family, with an unusual dress code specifying evening attire rather than the customary formal morning dress and hats. Queen Elizabeth, the Queen Mother, reportedly unimpressed by the informality of the request, wore a hat regardless, memorably declaring that she certainly intended to. Sophie's own wedding dress carried genuine, quiet extravagance beneath its understated appearance, stitched with roughly 325,000 diamonds, crystals, and pearls, though the overall silhouette was restrained and considerably less theatrical than Diana's famously voluminous gown had been nearly 2 decades earlier. She wore a pearl necklace Edward had given her as a wedding gift, along with the Anthemian tiara, borrowed from the Queen's own private collection. And in one further deliberate break from tradition, the couple chose not to perform the customary newlywed kiss for the assembled cameras, a small but pointed signal that their marriage and their affection for each other belonged to them rather than to the watching press. However much that same press had spent the preceding 6 years trying to claim ownership of every detail of their relationship. For their honeymoon, Edward and Sophie chose privacy over spectacle in a way that stood in sharp contrast to his older brother's own choices decades earlier. Both Charles and Andrew had spent their honeymoons cruising aboard the Royal Yacht Britannia in the 1980s. Edward and Sophie instead spent 2 quiet weeks at Balmoral in Scotland, a genuinely secluded estate well insulated from press intrusion, following in the footsteps of the Queen's own choice of honeymoon location decades before them. It was, in its own understated way, an early declaration of exactly the kind of married life they intended to build together, private, low-key, and deliberately uninterested in competing with the more theatrical royal unions that had come before them. That desire for privacy would be tested almost immediately by genuine, serious hardship rather than tabloid intrusion. In 2001, Sophie became pregnant for the first time, and the pregnancy turned out to be ectopic, developing dangerously outside the uterus in one of her fallopian tubes, a condition that is invariably fatal to the pregnancy itself and carries real-life, threatening risk for the mother if not treated promptly. Sophie was airlifted to a London hospital and underwent surgery lasting more than 2 hours. Anyone with any familiarity with the condition understands it as one of the more physically and emotionally devastating experiences a woman can go through. It was a genuine family tragedy, quietly absorbed largely out of public view, and it would go on, in a fairly direct way, to shape one of the more personally meaningful charitable causes Sophie has supported ever since. Her sustained patronage of air ambulance services, born directly out of her own experience of needing exactly that kind of emergency airlift to survive. It was this same year, 2001, that produced the single most damaging scandal of Sophie's early royal life, one considerably more serious in its institutional consequences than the topless photograph 2 years earlier had been. While still running her own public relations company alongside her royal duties, Sophie was targeted by Masha Mahmood, a News of the World journalist notorious for posing as a wealthy potential client, often styled as an Arab businessman, in order to draw indiscreet remarks out of unsuspecting public figures. Sophie, precisely because her professional training in public relations had taught her to charm and flatter a prospective client rather than treat them with suspicion, fell directly into the trap. In the course of what she believed was an ordinary, informal business meeting, she made a series of remarks she would come to regret deeply, describing the Queen in dismissive, overly familiar terms, predicting, with more accuracy than anyone quite wanted to admit publicly at the time, that Charles and Camilla were simply waiting for the Queen Mother's eventual death before marrying. Criticising the physical appearance of the then opposition leader, William Hague, and offering harsh personal commentary about Sherry Blair, the Prime Minister's wife. Most damaging of all, from the palace's own institutional perspective, was Sophie's candid acknowledgement that a public relations firm with genuine royal contacts carried an obvious, if never explicitly advertised, commercial advantage, a comment that struck directly at exactly the conflict of interest concerns Prince Charles himself had already, privately, warned might eventually become a serious problem. Sophie attempted to get ahead of the impending scandal by offering an exclusive interview to the News of the World itself, hoping to control the narrative by defending Edward against long-running, unfounded rumours about his sexuality and speaking candidly about the couple's private struggles to start a family. The strategy backfired badly. The fake sheikh story ran instead in a rival newspaper, and the scandal that resulted called into question not only Sophie's own judgment, but the competence of the palace's own press operation, which had gambled unsuccessfully on being able to suppress a damaging story by trading a different exclusive to a different outlet. Sophie's response, once the full scale of the damage became clear, was direct and, by most accounts, genuinely contrite. She issued personal apologies to the Queen, to the wider royal family, and to each of the political figures she had criticised. Coming on top of earlier criticisms she had already faced for commercial arrangements, like a paid appearance promoting the new Rover 75 car at the Frankfurt Motor Show, which had earned her PR firm a substantial fee, the fake sheikh episode made the underlying structural problem impossible to ignore any longer. A working member of the royal family simply could not maintain an independent commercial career without the two roles eventually, inevitably colliding. The result was that Sophie and Edward gave up their independent professional careers entirely and committed to becoming full-time working royals in 2002. A genuinely significant sacrifice for a woman who had built and valued her own independent income and professional identity for the better part of 15 years. The Queen, by most accounts, was considerably relieved by this decision, and compensated the couple with a sum reportedly in the region of £250,000 to help offset the income they would no longer be earning from their respective businesses. The more lasting reward, though, turned out to be the one that took decades rather than a single payment to materialize. A gradual, sustained rise toward a genuinely central and trusted position within the royal family, built entirely on the back of exactly the kind of careful, rule-following conduct Sophie adopted from that point onward. Family life brought Sophie one more genuine medical crisis before the difficult early period of her royal life finally settled into calmer waters. In November 2003, she gave birth to her daughter, Lady Louise, in an emergency that again placed her own life in serious danger. The delivery required an emergency caesarean section, during which Sophie lost a dangerous quantity of blood, and by some accounts she came within a matter of minutes of dying before doctors managed to stabilize her with a substantial blood transfusion. Edward, away on an official overseas engagement at the time, and not expecting his wife to go into labour as early as she did, rushed back to learn just how close he had come to losing her. Louise herself required continued specialist monitoring after birth and remained in hospital for a period even after Sophie herself had been discharged. The entire experience, by the couple's own later reflection on it, left them with a lasting appreciation for how fragile life genuinely is, and a corresponding determination not to take their family's health for granted going forward. Sophie became, in the process, the first member of the royal family to give birth in an ordinary NHS hospital rather than a private facility. Choosing Frimley Park Hospital in Surrey, and she returned there again for the birth of the couple's son James in 2007. She has remained closely connected to that same hospital ever since, supporting its work directly, and in 2014 returning to open its neonatal unit in a visit that visibly moved her. A tangible reminder of exactly what those specialist staff had once done to save both her own life and her daughter's. Louise's own early medical history, including treatment in childhood for a condition affecting one of her eyes, appears to have shaped Sophie's later, deeply personal commitment to charitable work focused on preventing avoidable blindness and improving access to basic eye care, particularly in developing countries where routine cataract surgery remains far less accessible than in Britain. That patronage has taken her personally into hospitals and clinics across multiple continents, observing sight-restoring surgeries directly rather than touring facilities from a comfortable ceremonial distance, a level of hands-on engagement colleagues in that specific field have repeatedly praised as considerably more genuine than the usual pattern of royal patronage. Her own experience with the air ambulance service that once saved her life during her ectopic pregnancy similarly transformed into sustained, active support for air ambulance charities across the country, driven by her stated conviction that everyone, regardless of location or circumstance, deserves access to exactly the kind of emergency care that had once been available to her. She also succeeded Princess Alexandra as patron of guide dogs, a cause she has embraced warmly, by all accounts partly reflecting her own family's genuine fondness for dogs. And she has taken on considerably harder, less comfortable international work as well, drawing sustained attention to conflict-related sexual violence in partnership with former Foreign Secretary William Hague's long-running initiative on the subject, travelling personally to places like South Sudan to meet directly with survivors, offering the kind of grounded, empathetic engagement that colleagues in that field have specifically credited with making an international impact simply by ensuring the world's attention, and by extension its accountability, follows wherever she chooses to go. What ultimately elevated Sophie's standing within the family to something considerably beyond simply being a reliable, rule-abiding royal was the specific, deepening personal relationship she built with Queen Elizabeth over the following 2 decades. It became something of an open secret among royal watchers that the Queen had remarked, early in Sophie's royal life, that she was the sort of woman who wouldn't stand out in a crowd, a comment that has sometimes been misread as an insult but was, by every credible account. Intended and understood within the family as genuine praise, after the exhausting drama generated by several of her other daughters-in-law over the preceding decades, the Queen appears to have found real, quiet relief in a new arrival who had no evident interest in eclipsing anyone else in the family. Sophie, for her part, appears to have understood precisely the balancing act required of her, showing genuine respect toward the Queen as both mother-in-law and monarch simultaneously, without ever losing her own, more relaxed, approachable, personal warmth in the process. That warmth showed up in small, telling details over the years. In a 2019 speech at Buckingham Palace connected to the Queen Elizabeth Diamond Jubilee Trust, Sophie addressed the monarch directly using a private family nickname, a moment that visibly moved observers present in the room and that royal commentators have pointed to repeatedly since as clear evidence of a relationship built on genuine affection rather than mere formal courtesy. The two women shared a mutual fascination with history, and Sophie has spoken about how the Queen took real active interest whenever she returned from her own international travels, given how much of the world the Queen herself had visited across 7 decades on the throne. Somewhat more surprisingly, the two also discovered a shared enthusiasm for war films, which they apparently watched together on more than one occasion, alongside their more expected common ground around horses and equestrian pursuits. Friends of Sophie's have described her as having a genuinely calming effect on the Queen, someone the monarch would turn to specifically during moments of stress or chaos within the wider family, valued for her steady, level-headed advice and her fundamental trustworthiness. That closeness deepened further still during the isolation of the coronavirus pandemic, when Edward and Sophie became part of what the household informally nicknamed HMS Bubble, the small, tightly restricted circle permitted to remain in close contact with the Queen and Prince Philip at Windsor Castle throughout the strictest period of lockdown. Living in that kind of enforced, sustained proximity for months on end appears to have only strengthened the bond further, and when Philip died in April 2021, Sophie and Edward were among the family members present to support the Queen through a loss made all the more painful by the pandemic-era restrictions that forced her to sit entirely alone in St. George's Chapel during his funeral. An image that became one of the most quietly devastating photographs of the entire pandemic. In the months and years that followed, as the Queen navigated widowhood after more than 70 years of marriage, Sophie's role within the family's private support structure became increasingly visible, accompanying her to church with striking regularity and providing exactly the kind of steady, undemanding company an elderly woman adjusting to profound loss needed most. When the Queen herself died at Balmoral on the 8th of September 2022, Sophie and Edward were among those who travelled urgently to Scotland as her condition declined in her final hours, and in the days of mourning that followed, Sophie offered visible, practical support to other family members navigating the shock of the loss, entirely consistent with the steady, undramatic role she had spent over 2 decades cultivating. King Charles's decision, the following year, to revive the title Duke of Edinburgh specifically for Edward, with Sophie becoming Duchess of Edinburgh alongside him, was widely understood within royal circles as a direct, deliberate tribute to that closeness and to the specific wishes both the late Queen and Prince Philip were known to have privately held regarding their youngest son and his wife. The symbolism ran deeper than simple family courtesy. Edinburgh had been Philip's own title for the better part of 7 decades, deeply associated in the national imagination with exactly the kind of hard-working, hands-on royal consort he had become, and before ascending the throne herself in 1952, Elizabeth had briefly held the title of Duchess of Edinburgh in her own right, during what she would later describe as one of the genuinely happiest, most low-pressure periods of her entire life, raising a young family before the full weight of the crown descended upon her. Sophie became only the fourth person in history to hold that specific title, inheriting it directly from the woman who had once held it herself, a detail widely read as one final, deeply personal statement from the Queen that Sophie was, in her own words as reported by those close to her, the real thing. The coronation of King Charles III in May 2023 placed the newly created Duke and Duchess of Edinburgh directly at the heart of the ceremony, with Sophie, Edward and their two children, Louise and James, included in the formal carriage procession back to Buckingham Palace. Sophie appeared to genuinely relish the entire occasion, turning up at community events and shared public lunches across the country in the days that followed, tucking into coronation-themed food alongside ordinary members of the public with evident enjoyment rather than the more reserved ceremonial detachment some royals bring to this kind of event. Her most widely discussed moment from the entire coronation weekend, though, came during the star-studded concert broadcast live from Windsor Castle, featuring performers including Katy Perry, Take That and Lionel Richie. Cameras caught Sophie visibly dancing along in the royal box, a spontaneous, unguarded display of genuine enjoyment that instantly endeared her to a wider public audience who hadn't necessarily been paying close attention to her many years of quieter, more conventional royal service up to that point. It was, by the assessment of several commentators who cover the family closely, the exact moment a broader public finally caught a glimpse of the relaxed, approachable personality her closer friends and family had always known. One further comparison deserves particular attention, because it illustrates precisely how differently Sophie's own model of adapting to royal life has played out relative to more recent arrivals. It has been reported that the Queen herself, recognising the parallel between Sophie's own experience of marrying in as a genuine outsider and Meghan Markle's arrival decades later, suggested that Meghan might benefit from speaking with Sophie directly about the specific challenges of adjusting to royal expectations. Meghan reportedly declined the offer, indicating she already had Harry's guidance and didn't require it. Sophie is said to have followed up regardless, inviting Meghan for tea at her own residence, Bagshot Park, an invitation that was apparently never reciprocated at Frogmore Cottage, given some of Meghan's own later, widely publicised complaints about not fully understanding certain royal protocols and expectations, including matters as specific as formal etiquette even within private family settings. The missed opportunity for that particular mentorship has struck several royal commentators as a genuinely lost chance, whatever the underlying reasons for it. Sophie has also become known within the family for a specific kind of physical, tactile warmth relatively unusual inside an institution famous for its emotional restraint. During the solemn procession carrying the Queen's coffin through Edinburgh, cameras captured Sophie offering quiet, visible physical support to Princess Anne, and she has been repeatedly photographed extending similarly warm, comforting gestures toward the younger generation of royal children, including Prince George. In a family whose older generations were raised on the explicit principle that visible emotion represented a kind of weakness, Sophie's more openly affectionate instincts have provided a genuinely different, softer texture to family life that several who know the family well have described as a welcome, humanizing contrast. That same instinct toward normalcy has shaped how she and Edward have raised their own two children. Louise and James have grown up without using the courtesy titles of Prince and Princess they were technically entitled to, styled instead as Lady Louise Windsor and for years Viscount Severn, a deliberate choice intended to give them as much as reasonably possible. An ordinary upbringing and the expectation that they would eventually earn their own living rather than depend entirely on royal status. Louise has recently begun university, having spent a summer working an ordinary job at a garden centre, and has developed a genuine passion for carriage driving, a pursuit she shares with the memory of her grandfather, Prince Philip, who was himself a devoted carriage driving enthusiast in his later years. All of this unfolds, worth noting with a touch of wry honesty, inside a 120-room mansion at Bagshot Park that the Queen gave the couple as a wedding gift, a detail Sophie herself has reportedly acknowledged with some genuine self-aware humour when discussing her hopes for giving her children a normal childhood, despite the rather extraordinary surroundings that childhood actually unfolds within. Since becoming a full-time working royal, Sophie has taken on patronage of more than 70 separate charitable organisations, and she has consistently ranked among the very hardest working members of the family by the simple, closely tracked metric of annual public engagements, typically placed just behind Edward himself, King Charles, and Princess Anne. With Prince Andrew's public role effectively ended following the fallout from his own association with Jeffrey Epstein, and with Harry and Meghan having stepped back from official royal duties entirely, the practical core of working royals under the age of 70 has narrowed dramatically, leaving Edward and Sophie alongside William and Kate, carrying a proportionally much heavier share of the institution's day-to-day public representation than either couple might otherwise have expected. That structural shift has, if anything, increased demand for exactly the kind of steady, uncomplaining service Sophie has specialised in for more than 2 decades, and it became especially visible during King Charles's own cancer diagnosis and treatment beginning in early 2024, when Sophie stepped forward without fanfare to cover engagements the King himself was medically unable to attend. There is a broader point worth drawing out of Sophie's particular version of royal success, because it runs so directly counter to the more familiar narratives that tend to dominate popular understanding of what makes a royal figure significant. The family's most enduringly famous women, Diana, Meghan, even Camilla, in her own more complicated way, achieved their public significance substantially through drama, through public struggle against the institution's own rigid expectations, through stories of genuine personal difficulty that resonated with a public increasingly sceptical of inherited privilege and hungry for evidence of authentic human experience underneath royal formality. Sophie's own early years actually included a fair amount of that same kind of genuine difficulty: the topless photograph scandal, the fake sheikh sting, 2 separate, genuinely life-threatening medical emergencies, any one of which could easily have derailed a less resilient royal career permanently. What ultimately distinguished her path was not the absence of hardship, but her response to it, rather than allowing those setbacks to define her, or using them as the basis for a public reckoning with the institution the way Diana and later Meghan each did, in their own different ways. Sophie absorbed each difficult episode, adjusted her approach, apologised when apology was warranted, and simply kept working, decade after decade, until the accumulated weight of that consistency became, in itself, one of the more genuinely admired qualities available inside the modern monarchy. None of this is to suggest her path came without real, lasting cost. The early professional humiliation of the fake sheikh scandal was genuinely damaging and, by her own later reflection, difficult to fully recover from. The loss of her independent business and income represented a real personal sacrifice for a woman who had built and valued her own professional identity for well over a decade before marrying into the family. And the 2 brushes with death during her own pregnancies represent the kind of genuine trauma that leaves permanent marks regardless of how gracefully a person eventually manages to discuss it in public. Sophie built her particular version of royal significance the hard way, through setbacks absorbed and quietly corrected rather than through any single transformative public moment. And the fact that her story resists easy dramatic summary is not evidence that it matters less than the louder, more famous royal narratives surrounding her. If anything, it suggests the opposite, that the specific, unglamorous discipline of surviving real failure, learning from it privately, and simply continuing to show up reliably for decades afterward, without ever demanding public credit for having done so, may be one of the more genuinely difficult achievements available inside an institution that has always rewarded exactly the opposite instinct in so many of its more famous members. Sophie, Duchess of Edinburgh, arrived into the British royal family in 1999 as a middle-class public relations executive with no obvious credentials for the role she was about to occupy, survived not one but two genuinely serious public scandals in her first years of marriage, endured two separate medical emergencies that nearly cost her own life, and spent the following 2 decades building, patiently and almost entirely without fanfare, the kind of sustained institutional trust that eventually made her one of the closest confidants available to the most famous woman in the world during the final years of her life. She did it without a single tell-all interview, and without ever positioning herself as the story rather than a quiet, reliable part of the much larger institutional story surrounding her. That may be exactly why so few people outside dedicated royal watchers fully appreciate how significant and how genuinely hard-won her own particular contribution has actually been. Thanks for watching. See you next time.